sky, Giordano Bruno. The ticking of time, often unnoticed, resonates with particular gravity when it settles upon the dawn of an existence destined to leave an indelible mark on history. In the heart of the 16th century, an era of fervor, obscurantism, and a nascent, at times timid, craving for knowledge, a man came to life whose destiny would be inextricably intertwined with the most strained threads of his time, Giordano Bruno. A name that even today evokes a shiver, a call to intellectual ardor and supreme sacrifice on the altar of freedom of thought. To fully grasp the blazing trajectory of this philosopher, heretic, and visionary of the infinite, it is essential to immerse oneself in the impetuous currents that shaped the world at the moment of his birth. We are in the year of grace 1548, an ordinary year for many, but full of ferments and tensions for those who had eyes to see them. Europe was a constantly shifting mosaic, a crucible of powers that confronted and redefined themselves, with religious faith serving as a watershed and, too often, as an incendiary fuse. The Protestant Reformation, which had erupted with the vehemence of a purifying storm only a few decades earlier thanks to Martin Luther's striking theses, had torn apart the monolithic unity of the Roman Catholic Church. It was no longer just a matter of theology or doctrine. It had become a political issue, a pretext for wars, alliances, and social upheavals that redrew maps and consciences. The shadow of the Council of Trent, still in full swing, loomed over the entire continent. Convened to respond to the Protestant challenge, the Council had intransigently reaffirmed Catholic dogmas, laying the groundwork for what would go down in history as the Counter-Reformation, a period of doctrinal reassertion, moral rigor, and, unfortunately, fierce repression against all forms of dissent. The stake, more than a punishment, was a warning, a gruesome spectacle intended to terrorize and stifle any nascent germ of independent thought. In this climate of religious ferment and rigid orthodoxy, the Italian peninsula was a theater of regional powers and foreign influences. A united Italy did not yet exist, rather, a constellation of states, duchies, republics, and kingdoms, often competing with each other or subject to the will of great powers like the Spanish Habsburgs or the Holy Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Naples, where Giordano Bruno would see the light, was under rigid Spanish rule. It was a vast kingdom, rich in history and culture, but also economically exploited and politically subjugated. Its cities teemed with life, with merchants, artisans, nobles, and the poor, a melting pot of dialects and traditions. Naples itself, with its lively port and strategic position in the Mediterranean, was a nerve center for trade and cultural exchange, but also a hotbed of social tensions and political intrigues. It is in this complex and turbulent scenario that, in a small village at the foot of Vesuvius, in Nola, the curtain rose on the life of Filippo Bruno, a name that would soon give way to the more famous Giordano. Nola, an ancient town, nestled in a landscape of olive groves and citrus orchards, was not a center of great cultural or political resonance, but it possessed the quiet simplicity of a province where life flowed according to ancestral rhythms. Here, in a modest house, the future philosopher was born and raised. His parents, Giovanni Bruno and Felissa Savellino, were figures of that rural bourgeoisie which formed the backbone of society at the time. Giovanni, the father, was a professional soldier, a man of arms who had served in the Spanish viceroy's army. Military life had tempered him, probably making him a man of few words, accustomed to discipline and order. His profession often kept him away from home, engaged in garrisons or military campaigns, which meant that the daily management of the family largely fell on the mother's shoulders. Of Fralissa Savellino, the mother, we know less, as was often the case for women of the time whose lives largely took place within the domestic sphere. However, it is reasonable to imagine a strong, practical woman, dedicated to the care of her children and the management of the home in her husband's absence. She was the one who wove the fabric of family life, imparted the first notions of morality, and watched over young Filippo's first steps. Despite his father's profession, which would suggest a certain economic stability, the Bruno family was not wealthy. They were well off, yes, enough to ensure their children a basic education, but not so opulent as to allow for particular comforts or privileges. Life in Nola, for the Bruno family, was marked by the rhythms of the province, by the agricultural seasons, by religious festivals, and by the scarce news that arrived from larger centers. The family environment in which Filippo grew up was permeated by traditional Catholic values. Religion was the cornerstone of social and individual life. The church bells marked the hours, religious holidays were the highlights of the year, and faith was the lens through which the world was interpreted. It was a world in which the divine and the earthly were deeply intertwined, in which philosophy still served theology, and in which every deviation from official doctrine was seen not only as an intellectual error, but as a mortal sin, a threat to the cosmic and social order. Yet, precisely in this context of rigid observance and consolidated traditions, young Filippo began to show the first signs of a keen intelligence and an insatiable curiosity. From an early age, his mind must have begun to ask questions, to wonder about the mysteries of existence, about those very doctrines that were instilled in him and which, perhaps, already seemed insufficient to contain the vastness of his nascent intuitions. His initial education, probably entrusted to local tutors or some priest of the village, introduced him to the basics of grammar, rhetoric, and religion, the fundamental tools for accessing the knowledge of the time. Bruno's birth period, therefore, is not a mere backdrop, but an active force that would shape his trajectory. It is the era in which scientific discoveries, albeit still embryonic, began to shake the foundations of traditional knowledge. Nikola Copernicus had already dared to postulate a heliocentric universe, a revolutionary theory that overturned the geocentric Aristotelian Ptolemaic view, which had been a bulwark of Christian cosmology for centuries. Although his work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, had been published in 1543, only a few years before Bruno's birth, its revolutionary scope was not yet fully perceived or accepted. It was a spark smoldering beneath the ashes, ready to flare up and illuminate new perspectives on the universe. This intellectual ferment, though still underground in many regions, was the air that the keenest thinkers were beginning to breathe. The geopolitical situation, with its fragmentation and religious tensions, would force Bruno into a life of wandering, exile, flights, and returns, making him a true citizen of the world, but also a perennial outsider. His path would be strewn with encounters with the most brilliant minds and the darkest powers of his time, a dangerous dance between enlightenment and persecution. Nola, with its simplicity and proximity to nature, may have instilled in young Filippo a love for the cosmos, for its beauty and complexity. Perhaps, looking at the night sky from the Nolan countryside, he was already beginning to glimpse the infinity of worlds and the grandeur of a universe far vaster than that taught by scholastic precepts. It is from this humus, from this mixture of rooted traditions and seeds of innovation, that the extraordinary mind of Giordano Bruno germinated, a man destined to become a beacon of freedom in an age of obscurantism, a martyr of reason in a world still dominated by dogma, a visionary whose gaze extended beyond the boundaries of the known, embracing an infinitude that his era was not yet ready to welcome. His journey had just begun, and it already promised to be an odyssey of intellect and spirit towards unexplored horizons and, unfortunately, towards an ineluctable destiny. The sun, a fiery orb in the Neapolitan sky, cast its golden light upon the modest home of the Bruno family in Nola. For young Filippo Bruno, as he was then known, these early years were a delicate dance between the rigid structures of the 16th century world and the boundless inner landscape of his own burgeoning mind. Born in 1548, Filippo was a child of his time, yet undeniably set apart by an insatiable curiosity that burned brighter than the village hearth. Life in Nola was simple, dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the unwavering beat of the church bells. A typical day for young Filippo would begin with the faint chirping of cicadas as dawn painted the sky in soft hues. After a frugal breakfast of bread and perhaps some local cheese or olives, shared with his parents, Giovanni and Fralissa, and any siblings, though historical records are sparse on his precise family structure beyond his immediate parents, his day would largely revolve around learning. Formal schooling for children of his social standing was basic but crucial. He likely attended a local school, perhaps run by the parish priest or a village tutor, where he would have grappled with the rudiments of Latin grammar, the lingua franca of scholarship and the church. Arithmetic, rudimentary rhetoric, and the catechism would also have been part of his daily lessons. But Filippo was not one to merely absorb. Even as a child, his mind was a restless sea, perpetually seeking new shores. While other children might have been content with games in the sun-drenched alleys or helping their parents with chores in the fields, Filippo often found himself drawn to books or to the quiet contemplation of the world around him. He wasn't necessarily a recluse. He would have played, certainly, and engaged in the simple joys of childhood. But there was always an underlying current of intense thought, a tendency to observe, to question, to delve deeper than superficial appearances. He was likely a child who asked why, constantly, much to the exasperation, or perhaps quiet pride, of his parents. His relationship with his parents was, from what we can infer, typical for the era, yet tinged with the unique challenge of raising such an unconventional mind. Giovanni Bruno, the soldier, was a man of discipline and practicality. He would have instilled in Filippo a sense of order, duty, and perhaps a certain toughness. One can imagine Giovanni wanting his son to follow a conventional path, perhaps even into military service, a stable and respectable profession. His experiences in the Spanish army would have shown him the hard realities of the world, and he likely valued conformity and safety. Fralissa Savellino, his mother, was likely the warmer, more nurturing presence. She would have overseen his early religious instruction, teaching him prayers and stories from the Bible. It was probably from her that he absorbed a deep sense of spirituality, albeit one that would later evolve far beyond conventional dogma. She would have been the one to recognize and perhaps encourage his intellectual leanings, though perhaps not fully grasping the radical depths to which they would lead him. Their home, while not intellectually stimulating in a formal sense, provided the foundation of his early life, a blend of traditional values and the quiet space for his mind to wander. What truly influenced Filippo in these tender years was not just formal education, but the very air he breathed. Nola, while small, was close enough to Naples, a vibrant hub of learning and culture, that echoes of its intellectual ferment would have reached the quiet countryside. Travelers, merchants, and even mendicant friars would have passed through, bringing news and ideas from the wider world. The natural beauty of the Campania region, with the imposing Vesuvius in the distance and the fertile plains surrounding Nola, surely fueled his nascent philosophical musings. One can envision him spending hours gazing at the stars from the solitude of his backyard, or wandering through the olive groves, lost in thought, already beginning to feel the vastness of a universe that the Church sought to contain within rigid Ptolemaic spheres. His character, even in these early years, would have displayed traits that would define his later life. Intellectual audacity, a profound stubbornness, and an uncompromising pursuit of truth. He wasn't timid or easily swayed. If he believed something, he would defend it with fierce conviction. This wasn't merely defiance for defiance's sake, but rather an innate drive to understand the fundamental nature of reality, to peel back the layers of received wisdom and examine the core. As he entered his teenage years, it became clear that Nola, for all its charm, could not contain the soaring ambitions of his intellect. The limited educational opportunities there were no longer sufficient. His parents, recognizing his exceptional abilities, perhaps encouraged by local priests or scholars who noted his brilliance, made the crucial decision to send him to Naples for further education. This was a significant step, a financial strain, but an investment in a future that, while uncertain, promised more than the life of a provincial soldier or merchant. In 1562, at the tender age of 14, Filippo arrived in the bustling, cacophonous city of Naples. This was a sensory explosion compared to the quiet Nola. The city, with its labyrinthine streets, its teeming markets, and its vibrant intellectual life centered around various monastic orders and academies, offered a stark contrast. It was here that he enrolled in the Augustinian convent of San Domenico Maggiore. The choice of a monastic order was common for bright young men seeking advanced education, as monasteries were often the repositories of knowledge and the centers of learning in the pre-university era. Within the cloistered walls of San Domenico Maggiore, Filippo shed his birth name, embracing the monastic name Giordano, likely in honor of Giordano Crispo, his logic master. This act symbolized not just a religious commitment, but a profound transformation, a crossing of a threshold into a life dedicated to study and spiritual contemplation. Here, he plunged into the rigorous curriculum of a Dominican novice. This included extensive study of Aristotelian philosophy, the foundational philosophical system of the medieval and Renaissance Church. He devoured texts on logic, metaphysics, ethics, and natural philosophy. He also delved deep into theology, meticulously studying the works of Thomas Aquinas, the intellectual giant of scholasticism, whose systematic theology provided the bedrock of Dominican thought. A typical day within the convent was highly structured. It began before dawn with matins, followed by lauds, then a period of personal study and contemplation. There would be classes throughout the day, lectures on logic, disputations where students debated complex theological and philosophical points, and long hours spent in the scriptorium, copying texts or poring over ancient manuscripts. Meals were taken in silence, often accompanied by readings from sacred texts. Vespers and Compline marked the end of the day, before the brothers retired to their simple cells. But even within this disciplined environment, Giordano's rebellious spirit began to show. While he excelled in his studies, mastering the intricacies of scholastic reasoning, he also began to question its limitations. The rigid adherence to Aristotelian cosmology, with its geocentric universe and its finite, perfect spheres, struck him as increasingly insufficient to explain the vastness he intuitively felt the cosmos possessed. He was exposed to the emerging, though still controversial, ideas of Copernicus, whose heliocentric model offered a tantalizing glimpse of a different kind of universe. While the convent's curriculum would have dismissed such ideas as heretical or speculative, Giordano's intellect was drawn to their daring simplicity and explanatory power. His independent thinking wasn't limited to cosmology. He found the dogmatic interpretations of Scripture and the philosophical constraints of scholasticism increasingly stifling. He was drawn to the mystical traditions, to Hermeticism, and to the occult sciences, which offered alternative ways of understanding the divine and the natural world, often through direct intuition and magical practices rather than rigid logical deduction. These were dangerous leanings for a Dominican friar in the throes of the Counter-Reformation. His character continued to solidify, intensely intellectual, profoundly spiritual, and fiercely independent. He was not a man to suffer fools gladly, nor to conform merely for convenience. This made him both brilliant and difficult, admired by some, but increasingly viewed with suspicion by others within the order. His daily interactions, even among his fellow friars, might have been marked by spirited debates, where his sharp wit and formidable intellect often left his opponents intellectually outmaneuvered, perhaps breeding resentment. In his limited free time, which would have been precious, Giordano might have sought out forbidden texts, perhaps smuggled into the convent library or found in the clandestine circles of Naples. He would have continued his nocturnal stargazing, now with a more informed, yet still intuitively rebellious eye. He might have engaged in quiet, clandestine conversations with a few like-minded friars who also felt the stirrings of new ideas. He was building his intellectual arsenal, but also, unknowingly, forging the chains of his future persecution. The years at San Domenico Maggiore, culminating in his ordination as a priest in 1572, were crucial. They provided him with the tools of critical thought, a vast knowledge of classical philosophy and theology, and the rigorous discipline of scholastic argumentation. But they also laid bare the tensions between his expansive vision of the cosmos and the restrictive dogma of the Church. He had mastered the rules, but only to understand how to break them, how to transcend them, in his relentless pursuit of an infinite universe and an infinite God, a pursuit that would ultimately cost him his life. The stage was set for a life of intellectual combat and perilous wanderings. The sacred walls of San Domenico Maggiore, once a sanctuary for Giordano Bruno's burgeoning intellect, began to feel less like a haven and more like a cage. By the time he was a young adult, his mind, sharpened by years of intense study and relentless questioning, had outgrown the confines of scholastic orthodoxy. He was no longer just Filippo, the bright boy from Nola. He was Giordano, the friar, the scholar, and, increasingly, the dissident. His early 20s saw him deepen his philosophical inquiries, pushing against the rigid boundaries of the Aristotelian universe endorsed by the Church. While his peers meticulously parsed the nuanced arguments of Aquinas, Giordano's gaze was already fixed on a grander stage, the infinite cosmos. He found solace and inspiration in thinkers far removed from the prescribed curriculum, the pre-Socratics, the atomists, and the mystical traditions of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. These ancient philosophies, often dismissed as pagan or dangerous by the Church, offered a liberating vision of a universe teeming with life, where God was not merely a distant creator, but an immanent force permeating all existence. This was his first profound realization, a seed that would blossom into his most revolutionary ideas, the concept of an infinite universe with innumerable worlds, each potentially inhabited, and a God identical with nature itself. This intellectual awakening, however, came at a steep price. His burgeoning ideas were not just philosophical theories. They were direct challenges to the very foundations of Christian dogma, particularly the unique creation of man and the centrality of earth in God's plan. Giordano was charismatic and brilliant, but also arrogant and uncompromising. He possessed a fiery temperament, a quick wit, and a devastating ability to dismantle an opponent's argument. These traits, while invaluable in intellectual discourse, made him ill-suited for the subtle diplomacy required within the hierarchical structure of the Dominican order. He made enemies easily. His sharp tongue, his disdain for superficial piety, and his open questioning of doctrines often put him at odds with his superiors and fellow friars. There are accounts of his open disregard for conventional religious practices. He reportedly removed images of saints from his cell, keeping only a crucifix, and advised a novice to read a forbidden text, Erasmus's Praise of Folly, a biting satire on clerical abuses. Such acts, seemingly minor, were gravely serious in an era dominated by the Counter-Reformation's zealous pursuit of orthodoxy. In 1575, at the age of 27, the inevitable happened. Charges of heresy were brought against him. The specific accusations were rooted in his nonconformist theological views and his possession of forbidden books. The shadow of the Inquisition loomed large, a chilling prospect for any intellectual daring to stray from the sanctioned path. The atmosphere within the convent, once a place of learning, now felt like a suffocating trap. Giordano knew that staying meant facing an ecclesiastical trial, the outcome of which, given his defiant nature, was likely to be condemnation. He chose to flee. One night in 1576, under the cloak of darkness, he slipped out of the convent in Naples, abandoning his habit and his vows. This was not merely an escape. It was a profound rupture with the life he had known, a declaration of intellectual independence that marked him forever as an apostate in the eyes of the Church. This act set him on a path of relentless wandering, a journey that would span nearly 2 decades and take him across the length and breadth of Europe. His first destination was Rome, a city of immense power and dangerous paradoxes. He briefly sought refuge at the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, attempting to clear his name. But the charges followed him, and the intellectual freedom he craved was nowhere to be found. He soon realized that Rome, the very heart of the Church, was no place for a free spirit like himself. His journey then became a relentless quest for a place where his ideas could flourish without fear of persecution. He traveled north, arriving in Genoa, then Noli, and Savona, earning a meager living by teaching grammar and astronomy to private students. He was a scholar without a patron, a philosopher without a platform, an academic exile. Life was uncertain, marked by constant movement and the need to adapt to new environments, new patrons, and new intellectual circles. His daily life during these early years of exile was a stark contrast to the structured existence of the monastery. He would wake with the sun, often in a rented room or the humble lodging provided by a temporary employer. His mornings would be dedicated to his own studies, to reading, writing, and refining his burgeoning philosophical system. He carried with him the intellectual tools honed in the monastery, but now applied them to a radically different set of questions. Afternoons would be spent teaching, imparting his vast knowledge to students, often of noble birth, who were eager for enlightenment. Evenings might involve engaging in informal discussions in taverns or private homes, seeking out kindred spirits, or simply walking the city streets, observing the world and pondering its mysteries. Did he have friends? Yes, but they were often fleeting connections, fellow intellectuals, or sympathetic patrons who recognized his genius. Yet, His fiery personality and uncompromising intellect often led to disputes, even with those who initially supported him. He was a man driven by ideas, often to the exclusion of deeper personal attachments. Was he in love? There is no historical record of Giordano Bruno ever forming a romantic relationship or having a family. His life was entirely consumed by his intellectual pursuits and his fervent belief in his mission to reveal the true nature of the cosmos. The demands of his nomadic existence, coupled with his dedication to philosophy, left little room for personal relationships in the conventional sense. He was, in many ways, married to his ideas, a passionate suitor of truth. His dreams and aspirations were monumental. He dreamed of a world where knowledge was not chained by dogma, where human reason could soar to understand the infinite universe, and where a profound, pantheistic spirituality could unite all beings. He envisioned himself as a reformer, not just of philosophy, but of human thought itself, leading humanity out of the darkness of scholasticism into a new age of enlightened understanding. He believed his ideas had the power to transform society, to reconcile science and religion in a grand, unified vision of the cosmos. The difficulties in achieving these dreams were immense. The primary obstacle was the Catholic Church, a monolithic institution determined to crush any challenge to its authority. But there were also practical challenges: constant financial insecurity, the need to find new places to live and work, the exhausting intellectual battles with established scholars, and the pervasive fear of being discovered by the inquisitorial network that spanned Europe. He was a prophet without a homeland, a genius without a secure base. His character, forged in the fires of these early struggles, became even more defined, courageous, bordering on reckless, brilliant, bordering on hubris, passionate, bordering on fanaticism. He was a man who embraced discomfort and danger for the sake of his convictions. He believed profoundly in the power of the human mind to grasp the divine, and this belief fueled his relentless pursuit of truth, pushing him ever onward, through Italy, then to France, to England, to Germany, and back to Italy, always seeking, always teaching, always challenging. This period of his life was a crucible, refining his ideas and hardening his resolve, preparing him for the monumental intellectual battles that lay ahead and for the ultimate confrontation that awaited him. Having shed the monastic habit and the shackles of dogma, Giordano Bruno embarked on an odyssey that transformed him from a fugitive friar into a global intellectual force. His flight from Naples in 1576 marked the true beginning of his public intellectual life, a period defined by an insatiable hunger for knowledge, a relentless pursuit of his cosmic vision, and an escalating series of confrontations with the entrenched powers of his age. His journey through Italy after leaving Naples was a restless dance. He briefly touched down in Rome, then northward to Nali, Savona, Turin, and Venice, where he even published two small works, De Segni dei Tempi, on the signs of the times, and Clavis Magna, Great Key, under the pseudonym Giordano Nolano. These early writings hinted at his mystical leanings and his burgeoning interest in the art of memory, a skill he would later master and use to great effect. He supported himself by teaching grammar and the art of memory, a crucial skill in an era before widespread printing, captivating audiences with his sharp mind and prodigious memory. The intellectual climate in Italy remained stifling, however. The tentacles of the Inquisition stretched far and wide, and Bruno's reputation as a renegade friar preceded him. He understood that to truly express his radical ideas, he needed to seek refuge in lands where the grip of the Counter-Reformation was weaker or where intellectual discourse was more open. Thus, in 1579, he crossed the Alps, venturing into the heart of Europe. His first significant stop was Geneva, the austere bastion of Calvinism, a place that, on the surface, promised religious freedom. Here, he hoped to find a sanctuary for intellectual exploration. He embraced the Protestant faith, at least outwardly, and taught philosophy at the local academy. However, Bruno's fiery, uncompromising nature quickly clashed with the strict Calvinist orthodoxy. His criticisms of the local university, coupled with his defense of certain heterodox views, led to his excommunication from the Calvinist Church after just a few months. He was arrested, jailed, and only released after publicly recanting his criticisms. This experience underscored a bitter truth. Even outside the Catholic Church, religious dogmatism, whether Catholic or Protestant, was a formidable foe to his boundless spirit of inquiry. He learned that freedom of thought was a rare commodity indeed, found neither in Rome nor in Geneva. Undeterred, Bruno moved on, his mind buzzing with ideas that refused to be contained. He traveled to Toulouse, France, a renowned center of learning, where he earned a professorship in philosophy. For a brief period, he enjoyed a measure of intellectual freedom, teaching Aristotle and delivering lectures. It was in Toulouse that he began to articulate more fully his vision of an infinite universe. He engaged in passionate debates, captivating students with his eloquence and challenging established norms. Yet, the religious wars tearing France apart made his position precarious. The escalating conflict between Catholics and Huguenots meant that a freethinker like Bruno, who acknowledged neither side's absolute truth, was inherently vulnerable. The next pivotal chapter of his life unfolded in Paris in 1581 under the patronage of King Henry III. The French monarch, captivated by Bruno's extraordinary memory and his fascinating philosophical discussions, granted him the position of Reader Extraordinary, allowing him to lecture at the prestigious College de Cambrai. This was a zenith of his academic career, a period of relative peace and profound intellectual output. It was in Paris that he published several important works on the art of memory, including De Umbris Idearum, on the shadows of ideas, Ars Memoriae, the art of memory, and Cantus Circeus, Circe's song. These works, while ostensibly about mnemonic techniques, also served as vehicles for his deeper philosophical and cosmological ideas, subtly weaving in his notion of a unified, animate cosmos. He became a celebrated figure in the Parisian intellectual scene, engaging with leading scholars and even becoming an informal advisor to the king. Despite this success, Bruno was a man driven by a restless intellect. He felt compelled to share his most radical ideas on a grander stage. In 1583, armed with letters of recommendation from Henry III, he moved to England, a country that, under Queen Elizabeth I, offered a more liberal intellectual environment. He settled in London and later in Oxford, engaging directly with the cream of English academia. His time in England, particularly in London, was arguably the most productive and intellectually fertile period of his life. He lectured at Oxford University, though his unconventional teaching style and his scathing critiques of Aristotelianism alienated many conservative scholars. It was here, however, that he wrote and published his most celebrated and controversial works, the Italian Dialogues, a series of 6 philosophical treatises published in 1584, La Cena de Luceneri, the Ash Wednesday Supper, De la Causa, Principio et Uno, on cause, principle, and unity, De El Infinito, Universo e Mondi, on the infinite, universe and worlds, Spatio de la Bestia Triumphanti, The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, Cabala del Cavallo Pegasio, Cabal of the Pegasion Horse, and Degli Eroici Furori, the Heroic Frenzies. These dialogues were revolutionary. In De L'Infinito, Universo e Mondi, he boldly championed the Copernican model, but extended it far beyond Copernicus's own cautious formulation. Bruno argued not only for a heliocentric system, but for an infinite universe containing an infinite number of suns, stars, each potentially surrounded by its own planets, many of them inhabited. This vision shattered the traditional finite, geocentric, anthropocentric cosmos, implying a God of limitless power and an infinitely diverse creation. His universe was alive, animated by a single, immanent divine principle. The Ash Wednesday Supper detailed a contentious dinner debate at the home of Fulk Greville, where Bruno defended Copernicanism and lambasted English pedantry. On cause, principle, and unity laid out his pantheistic metaphysics, arguing for the unity of God, nature, and matter. The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast was a satirical critique of corrupt religious practices and moral failings. The Heroic Frenzies explored his mystical philosophy, portraying the intellectual's passionate, almost divine, quest for knowledge. During his English sojourn, Bruno formed significant relationships. He enjoyed the patronage of Michel de Castelnau de Mauvissiere, the French ambassador to England, whose house in London became a hub for intellectual exchange. He also met and engaged with prominent English intellectuals of the time, including Philip Sidney and possibly William Shakespeare, though direct evidence of the latter is elusive. His friendships, however, were often turbulent. His fierce intellectual honesty and willingness to provoke meant that even those who admired his genius often found his personality abrasive. He was a man propelled by an internal fire, indifferent to social niceties when intellectual truth was at stake. His objectives during this period were clear: to publish his ideas, to challenge the philosophical and theological orthodoxy that stifled human understanding, and to spread his vision of a limitless cosmos. He achieved these objectives spectacularly with the publication of his Italian dialogues, which reverberated across Europe. He reached his goals by sheer intellectual force, by the power of his arguments, and by his unyielding conviction. But at what price? The price was isolation and increasing peril. While England offered a temporary reprieve from the Roman Inquisition, Bruno's radicalism earned him enemies everywhere. His outspoken criticisms of Oxford scholars and his controversial religious views. He was neither a staunch Catholic nor a true Protestant, but rather a self-proclaimed philosopher of a new, universal religion, made him a pariah in established academic and religious circles. He was a man ahead of his time, and his visionary ideas, far from being embraced, were largely met with incomprehension or outright hostility. The feelings that animated Bruno during this period were a complex mix of exhilaration at the unfolding of his grand vision, frustration at the intellectual myopia of his contemporaries, and a deep, underlying loneliness born from his unique intellectual path. He was a man driven by a profound sense of mission, convinced that his ideas were vital for the progress of humanity. This conviction gave him immense courage to face constant opposition and insecurity. His departure from England in 1585, following a heated public disputation at Oxford where he felt misunderstood and unfairly treated, marked the end of his most productive and relatively safe period. He returned to France, then embarked on a series of less successful ventures in Germany. He lectured in Wittenberg, the cradle of the Reformation, where he taught Aristotle in an attempt to build bridges, but again, his radical views on the infinite universe led to his expulsion. He taught in Prague, Helmstedt, and Frankfurt, constantly seeking a permanent academic position, a platform for his ideas, but always encountering resistance. He was a philosopher without a home, a true cosmic wanderer, his spirit expanding as the known world seemed to shrink around him. The successes were fleeting, the setbacks constant, but his core beliefs in an infinite universe and the ultimate unity of all things remained unshaken, guiding his every step towards an inevitable, tragic denouement. Giordano Bruno's steps, those of an tireless intellectual wanderer, had never been as uncertain as in 1591. After years of peregrinations through the courts and universities of Europe, from Paris to London, from Wittenberg to Prague, from Helmstedt to Frankfurt, his restless soul, though filled with an unparalleled cosmic vision, began to feel the burden of a nomadic existence. The world, which he had sought to illuminate with his ideas about the infinite, seemed to reciprocate only hostility and incomprehension. The final years of his life, those that would lead him to the tragic epilogue, were a crescendo of disillusionment and reckless choices. Despite his intellectual successes and the aura of genius that surrounded him, Bruno had never managed to find a safe harbor, a university or court that would guarantee him the stability and freedom necessary to deepen and disseminate his ideas without fear. His radical positions on the infinity of the universe, the plurality of worlds, and the immanent divine nature of matter found no fertile ground in a continent still deeply divided by religious wars and dominated by the rigor of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and Protestant orthodoxy. He was an outsider everywhere, too Catholic for Protestants, too Protestant for Catholics, and too much of a philosopher and mystic for both. In this climate of weariness and frustration, in 1591, Bruno made a decision that would prove fatal. He accepted an invitation to return to Italy. The invitation came from a young Venetian nobleman, Giovanni Mocenigo, who presented himself as a fervent admirer of Bruno's art of memory and wished to study with him. For Bruno, this offer represented a potential opportunity. Venice, the Serenissima, was known for its relative religious tolerance and cultural openness, very different from papal Rome. Perhaps, he thought, he could finally find a less hostile environment there, a patron who would allow him to continue his studies and publish freely. The hope of seeing his homeland again, after 15 years of exile, must have weighed heavily. Thus, against the advice of many friends and, ultimately, against his own prudence, which, to be fair, had never been his primary virtue, Bruno made his return to Italy. He settled in Venice, taking Mocenigo as his student. For a while, the situation seemed promising. Bruno taught his mnemonics, deepened his philosophical reflections, and perhaps felt a sense of ephemeral peace. However, his polemical nature and unshakable intellectual honesty soon re-emerged. Mocenigo, his disciple, quickly proved to be a superficial individual, incapable of grasping the depth of Bruno's thought and, perhaps, envious of his master. The relationship quickly soured. Mocenigo's goal was not admiration, but the expectation of learning mnemonic tricks for pure personal gain, not a thirst for philosophical knowledge. Bruno's disappointment was bitter. The culmination of the betrayal occurred on May 23, 1592. Mocenigo, in an act of petty revenge, and perhaps out of fear that Bruno might reveal secrets about him or openly criticize his limited abilities, denounced him to the Venetian Inquisition. The accusations were extremely grave: heresy, blasphemy, immoral conduct, and the dissemination of doctrines contrary to the Catholic faith, including his vision of the infinity of worlds. It was the deadly trap. Bruno was immediately arrested and imprisoned in the Venetian jails. Here, A long and tormented process began. During the interrogations, Bruno attempted a complex defense strategy. He admitted some theological deviations, but declared himself faithful to the core of Catholic doctrine, trying to distinguish his philosophy from his religious convictions. He argued that his cosmological theories were philosophical and not theological, and that he did not intend to contradict the Holy Scriptures. It was a desperate attempt to save himself, a compromise between his thirst for truth and the harsh reality of inquisitorial power. The Venetian authorities, who enjoyed a certain autonomy from Rome, might have treated the case with greater leniency. But the Roman Inquisition, led by Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, a future saint and one of Galileo Galilei's most ardent persecutors, claimed jurisdiction over Bruno's case, considering him an exceptionally dangerous heretic. On February 27, 1593, Giordano Bruno was transferred to the prisons of the Holy Office in Rome, where he remained imprisoned for the next 7 years. These 7 years of imprisonment were an ordeal. Bruno was subjected to numerous interrogations, psychological pressure, and likely torture, although the chronicles do not provide explicit details. His physical and mental health was severely tested. Surrounded by jailers and inquisitors, deprived of freedom and the possibility to study and write, he had to face solitude and despair. Yet, despite the exhausting trials, his intellectual spirit did not break entirely. He was repeatedly asked to retract his doctrines, to renounce his cosmological and theological errors. For a period, it seems he tried to find a compromise formula, a way to reconcile his ideas with orthodoxy, driven by the hope of saving himself. However, as the years passed, and faced with the inquisitor's insistence on a full and unconditional retraction, Bruno realized that he could never deny the core of his philosophy, the infinity of the universe, the multiplicity of worlds, and the immanence of God in nature. For him, these were not mere hypotheses, but profound and sacred truths, the fruit of years of study and contemplation. Renouncing them would have meant betraying his own soul, his reason for being. It was in these final years that his courage and intellectual integrity manifested in all their power. Faced with imminent condemnation, he chose not to yield. His last answers to the inquisitors were a clear refusal to abjure. "Perhaps you who pronounce my sentence are in greater fear than I who receive it," he is said to have declared at the moment the sentence was read. These words, charged with defiance and dignity, have become the symbol of his indomitable resistance. On February 8, 1600, the sentence was pronounced. Giordano Bruno was declared an impenitent, pertinacious, and obstinate heretic. He was condemned to be handed over to the secular arm, that is, the civil authorities, to be burned alive. For the inquisitors, the stake was not only a punishment, but an act of purification, a way to extirpate heresy and save the heretic's soul, as well as serving as a terrible warning for all who dared to challenge dogma. On February 17, 1600, at dawn, Giordano Bruno was led to Campo de' Fiori, a lively square in Rome, usually a marketplace. That day, however, it had been transformed into a theater of death. He was offered one last chance to kiss a crucifix, a gesture of final repentance, but he refused, turning away the sacred symbol. His mouth was likely clamped shut to prevent him from uttering words deemed blasphemous or heretical before the crowd. He was tied to a stake and burned alive. The flames enveloped his body, but not his memory, nor his ideas. The world had changed immensely since his birth in 1548. Italy, from a fragmented land of principalities, was now even more firmly under Spanish influence, and, above all, under the tight grip of the Counter-Reformation. The Church had reasserted its authority with relentless force, stifling many of the intellectual and artistic impulses that had characterized the early Renaissance. Scientific discoveries, like the Copernican model, were viewed with increasing suspicion and forbidden. The climate had become less tolerant, more repressive. Was he satisfied with himself in his final years? Likely a mix of profound dissatisfaction with the world's inability to embrace his ideas and a fierce satisfaction in his integrity. He had not achieved his dream of reforming the knowledge and faith of all Europe, but he had maintained his faith in the truth he had discovered. He died without abjuring, a martyr for freedom of thought, his mind still firm in his convictions about the infinite. His last hours were spent with the awareness of his condemnation, but also, perhaps, with the certainty of having remained true to himself and his vision. He did not spend his last years in the company of friends or family, but in that most extreme of solitudes, prison, interrogation, condemnation, and finally the stake, with only the company of his thoughts and his indomitable will. The smoke from the pyre on Campo de' Fiori dissipated into the Roman sky on that cold morning of February 17, 1600, carrying with it the last mortal breath of Giordano Bruno. But what the flames consumed was merely flesh, the ideas, the fervent spirit, the boundless vision of the philosopher of the infinite could not be extinguished. Indeed, in death, Bruno ascended from a controversial, wandering scholar to a potent symbol, an unquenchable flame that would illuminate the path for future generations. His execution, intended to silence dissent, ironically amplified his voice across the centuries. Bruno's most profound and enduring contribution to the world lies in his cosmological vision and his metaphysical audacity. While Nicholas Copernicus had timidly proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, and Galileo Galilei would later provide empirical evidence for it, it was Bruno who took the conceptual leap into the infinite. He was the first to openly and philosophically declare a universe that was not merely heliocentric, but infinite in extent, containing innumerable stars, each a sun like our own, potentially orbited by its own planets, many of them teeming with life. This was a radical break from the finite, geocentric, and anthropocentric cosmos that had dominated Western thought since Aristotle and Ptolemy, and which had been sanctified by the Church. His vision of the universe was intrinsically linked to his pantheistic philosophy, where God was not a transcendent being separate from creation, but rather an immanent force, the anima mundi, soul of the world, permeating every atom and every star. For Bruno, the universe was an infinite, living organism, and God was its infinite, unifying principle. This dissolved the rigid distinction between creator and created, elevating nature itself to a divine status. This was a direct challenge to orthodox Christian theology, which emphasized God's transcendence and man's unique place in a divinely ordered, finite cosmos. Bruno's legacy is, therefore, multifaceted. 1. A pioneer of modern cosmology. While not a scientist in the modern sense, he conducted no experiments or mathematical calculations. He was a visionary conceptualizer. He pushed the boundaries of astronomical thought far beyond his contemporaries, laying the philosophical groundwork for later scientific discoveries. His ideas resonated with thinkers like Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton, who, though differing in their methods, shared a conception of a vast, law-governed universe. His boldness in imagining an infinite cosmos was a crucial imaginative leap for the scientific revolution. 2. A champion of intellectual freedom. More than any specific doctrine, Bruno became a martyr for freedom of thought. His refusal to recant, even in the face of agonizing death, made him a powerful symbol against dogmatism and intellectual repression. His defiance resonated through the Enlightenment and beyond, inspiring those who fought against censorship and for the right to independent inquiry. He embodied the courage to stand by one's convictions, even when those convictions challenged the most powerful institutions of the age. 3. A bridge between science, philosophy, and mysticism. Bruno uniquely blended nascent scientific thought with deep philosophical and mystical traditions. He drew upon Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and ancient atomism to construct a unified vision of reality. While his embrace of magic and occult sciences might seem anachronistic today, it was typical of Renaissance thought and reflected a holistic approach to knowledge that sought to unify the spiritual and the material. He saw the universe not just as a mechanical system, but as a living, breathing entity imbued with divine spirit. 4. An influence on later thinkers. While his works were placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Forbidden Books, and largely ignored or condemned for centuries, his ideas began to resurface and gain appreciation from the 18th century onwards. Enlightenment thinkers, attracted to his anti-dogmatism, rediscovered him. G.W.F. Leibniz and Benedict Spinoza, for instance, are sometimes seen as philosophical heirs to his pantheistic views, albeit within different metaphysical frameworks. The German Romantics, particularly Goethe and Schiller, found inspiration in his vision of an animate, infinite universe. In the 19th century, philosophers like Friedrich Schelling explicitly recognized Bruno as a precursor to their own philosophies of nature. Today, Giordano Bruno is passionately studied by historians of philosophy, science, and religion. His works, once obscure, are now widely available and translated, providing invaluable insights into the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance and the early modern period. Scholars debate the precise nature of his scientific contributions versus his philosophical and mystical ones, but there is universal agreement on his unique role in intellectual history. His legacy is not merely academic. It has a profound cultural resonance. He is remembered in popular culture as the quintessential freethinker and martyr to scientific truth, often erroneously placed alongside Galileo as a direct scientific precursor, though their methods were vastly different. Statues of Bruno stand in Rome's Campo dei Fiori, erected by freethinkers in the late 19th century as a symbol of defiance against clerical authority, and in his hometown of Nola. These monuments are not just tributes to a man, but to the ideals he embodied. Courage in the face of oppression, the relentless pursuit of truth, and the boundless potential of human reason and imagination. His spirit continues to inspire anyone who champions the right to question, to explore, and to imagine beyond the conventional. In a world still grappling with dogmatism and the suppression of ideas, Bruno's story remains a powerful reminder of the enduring struggle for intellectual freedom. He might have died alone and condemned, but his cosmic vision, born from an insatiable curiosity and an unwavering spirit, ignited a philosophical and imaginative revolution that continues to resonate long after the flames of Campo dei Fiori have turned to ash. He contributed to the history of the world by daring to think infinitely, expanding the very boundaries of human conception and preparing the ground for a universe far vaster and more wondrous than his contemporaries could ever have imagined. He died a heretic, but lived as a prophet of the infinite.